Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. An uneasy encounter at the gate. The airport terminal buzzed with activity as travelers hurried to their gates, the clattering of rolling luggage echoing against the glass walls. Among the throng stood Richard Calloway, a man in his mid-40s, with an air of practiced composure. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit and polished leather shoes, he adjusted the strap of his designer briefcase and checked his smartwatch. Time was of the essence for someone like Richard, a senior executive at a thriving consultancy firm, and every minute not spent being productive felt like a loss. He glanced around Gate 12, assessing his fellow passengers. The priority line had begun forming, and as always, Richard felt a sense of satisfaction knowing he was among the few entitled to board first. First class was a realm he had worked tirelessly to access. Years of grinding through long hours and corporate politics had earned him this privilege. It wasn't just about comfort, it was a statement of success. Flight AA625 to Atlanta is now boarding priority passengers, the gate agent's voice rang through the speakers. Richard moved to the front of the line, his boarding pass in hand. The agent greeted him with a polite smile, and he gave a curt nod in return. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he felt a sense of relief. In moments, he would settle into a plush leather seat, sipping a pre-flight cocktail while reviewing his presentation for the next big meeting. The first-class cabin greeted him with its usual understated luxury. Warm lighting, spacious seats, and the faint scent of leather and brewed coffee created an inviting atmosphere. Richard found his assigned seat, 2C, an aisle seat with generous legroom. He stowed his briefcase in the overhead bin and retrieved his tablet, prepared to refine his talking points for the presentation. He had just begun scrolling through his notes when he sensed someone approaching. Out of habit, Richard glanced up, expecting another passenger who fit the familiar mold of first-class travelers, business people, retirees on luxury vacations, or the occasional celebrity. Instead, he saw a tall black man in a casual but neatly pressed shirt and jeans, carrying a worn backpack. The man paused at Richard's row and smiled warmly. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, holding up his boarding pass. "Looks like I'm in 2B, right next to you." Richard's smile froze, the words catching in his throat. Yes, that's right," he managed to say, though his tone was tight. The man, who introduced himself as Daryl, stored his backpack and settled into the window seat. His demeanor was calm and self-assured, completely at ease in his surroundings. He pulled out a hardcover book, one with a title Richard recognized as a biography of Frederick Douglass. Richard adjusted his seating position, his mind whirring with unease. It wasn't that he considered himself a racist, he prided himself on his professionalism and fairness. Yet, something about Daryl's presence unsettled him. This was first class, a space that Richard subconsciously associated with a particular kind of exclusivity. Daryl didn't fit the unspoken profile. The flight attendant arrived, her cheerful smile and blonde bun giving her a polished, professional appearance. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she greeted. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" Daryl smiled politely. "Just water, please." "Scotch, neat," Richard said, his voice more curt than intended. As the attendant left to fetch their drinks, Richard found himself drumming his fingers on the armrest. He stole glances at Daryl, who had already immersed himself in his book. Was he some kind of celebrity? An athlete? Or had he merely gotten lucky with an upgrade? The thought gnawed at him. When the attendant returned with their drinks, Richard seized the opportunity to speak to her privately. "Miss," he began in a low voice, "I need to discuss a seating issue with you." "Of course," she replied, her expression neutral. "Would you mind stepping toward the galley so we can talk more comfortably?" Richard nodded and followed her, his polished shoes clicking softly against the carpeted floor. Once out of earshot, he turned to her with a controlled but firm tone. "There's been a mistake with the seating," he said. "The gentleman in 2B doesn't seem to belong here. Is it possible his ticket was misread or perhaps there's been an overbooking issue?" The flight attendant tilted her head slightly, her polite smile unwavering but her eyes steely. Sir, all passengers in first class have been properly ticketed. I can assure you there's been no mistake. Richard's frustration mounted. Look, I fly first class regularly. I'm a platinum tier member. I've never seen this happen before. Is there any way to rectify this? The attendant's smile faltered, replaced by a firm professionalism. Sir, if you're uncomfortable with your seating arrangement, I'd be happy to check for any available seats in economy. Economy? Richard's voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. I'm not the one who should move. Then I'm afraid there's nothing I can do, she said calmly. Richard returned to his seat, his face tight with barely contained irritation. Darryl glanced up briefly, offering a polite smile before returning to his book. The interaction left Richard stewing, his mind racing with indignation. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the sanctity of the space he had worked so hard to occupy. Yet, the more he tried to justify his feelings, the more uneasy he became. As the plane began to taxi, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this flight would be unlike any other he had taken, and that Darryl might have more to teach him than he cared to admit. Turbulence on the ground. Richard returned to his seat in a state of smoldering indignation. His conversation with the flight attendant had yielded no resolution, and now he found himself back where he started, seated next to Darryl. To his growing irritation, Darryl seemed entirely unbothered by the situation. The man sat comfortably, engrossed in his book, turning the pages with the kind of focus that suggested he was miles away from the tension simmering beside him. Richard pulled out his tablet and attempted to review his presentation notes. Yet, for all his efforts, the words on the screen refused to stick. His thoughts kept drifting back to the audacity of the airline and the unfairness of his predicament. He glanced at Darryl from the corner of his eye. The man's calm presence grated on him. Wasn't he aware of the discomfort he was causing? A flight attendant moved down the aisle, preparing to close the overhead bins. Richard seized the opportunity and flagged her down. This one, an older woman with a no-nonsense air, leaned in politely. Yes, sir? Are you sure there's no way to make an adjustment? Richard asked, lowering his voice to keep their conversation private. I'm willing to compensate if necessary. The flight attendant arched a brow, her expression betraying a flicker of irritation. Sir, all first-class seats are occupied. Unless you'd like to downgrade to economy, there's nothing I can do. Her tone left no room for negotiation. Feeling the heat rise in his neck, Richard leaned back in his seat and forced himself to nod curtly. Thank you, he said, though the words felt hollow. The attendant moved on, leaving Richard to stew in silence. He fiddled with the recline button on his seat, adjusted his tray table, and reorganized the items in his armrest compartment, all futile attempts to regain a sense of control. Meanwhile, Darryl closed his book momentarily and glanced out the window, watching as the last few bags were loaded into the cargo hold. His demeanor was unshaken, his posture relaxed. Finally, he turned toward Richard and spoke. Busy day? He asked casually. Richard froze, caught off guard by the directness of the question. Excuse me? I noticed your tablet earlier, Darryl continued, gesturing toward it. Looks like you've got a lot on your plate. Work trip? Richard hesitated, unsure whether to engage. But the man's tone was friendly, devoid of sarcasm or judgment, and despite himself, Richard answered. Something like that, he said stiffly. Big presentation in Chicago. Darryl nodded appreciatively. Corporate world, huh? I've been there. High stakes, lots of pressure. Richard blinked. He hadn't expected that response. You've worked in corporate? For a while, Darryl said, leaning back in his seat. These days, I'm in nonprofit consulting. But I know what it's like to chase deadlines and deal with demanding clients. Richard's skepticism must have shown, because Darryl chuckled softly. You're wondering how I ended up in first class, aren't you? The bluntness of the question made Richard's stomach flip. He opened his mouth to deny it, but Darryl held up a hand, his expression good-natured. No offense taken, Daryl said. It's not every day you see someone like me up here. But I fly a lot for work, speaking engagements, strategy workshops, that kind of thing. Miles add up fast. Richard nodded, unsure how to respond. The candidness of Daryl's explanation disarmed him, and for a moment, he felt a twinge of embarrassment for his earlier assumptions. You said nonprofit consulting? Richard asked, more to keep the conversation going than out of genuine curiosity. That's right, Daryl replied. I work with organizations focused on community development and education reform. Helping people build better lives, one step at a time. There was a sincerity in Daryl's voice that caught Richard off guard. It was the kind of earnestness that felt foreign in his world of profit margins and shareholder reports. That must be fulfilling, Richard said, though the word felt clumsy on his tongue. It is, Daryl said, smiling. Tough work, but it reminds you what really matters. Their conversation was interrupted by the captain's voice crackling over the intercom, announcing that the flight would soon begin taxiing to the runway. Passengers were asked to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for takeoff. Richard leaned back in his seat, his mind swirling. The man beside him had just shattered the narrow assumptions Richard had built in his head. Daryl didn't fit neatly into the boxes Richard had created, and that realization left him unsettled. As the plane began to move, Richard couldn't help but feel that he had already embarked on a journey, one that had little to do with the destination printed on his boarding pass. Shattering assumptions. As the plane ascended into the sky, the familiar hum of the engines filled the cabin. The shift in pressure made Richard's ears pop, a minor discomfort compared to the larger unease building within him. He stared straight ahead, his tablet resting unused on his lap. Despite his efforts to refocus on work, his mind kept drifting back to the man seated beside him. Daryl, for his part, had resumed reading his book. The soft glow of the overhead light illuminated his face, a picture of calm. Richard couldn't help but steal glances at the book's cover, From the Ashes, Stories of Overcoming Adversity. The title stirred something in Richard, but he quickly brushed it aside, chalking it up to coincidence. The flight attendants began their beverage service, moving efficiently through first class. Richard ordered another scotch, while Daryl requested coffee. Cream and sugar? The flight attendant asked. Just black, thank you, Daryl replied with a polite smile. Richard watched the interaction, struck by how effortlessly Daryl engaged with people. His demeanor was warm and approachable, a stark contrast to Richard's guarded formality. When the drinks arrived, Daryl set his book down and turned toward Richard again. So, what's the big presentation about? He asked, his tone genuinely curious. Richard hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to discussing work with strangers, especially not on flights. But something about Daryl's demeanor made it hard to dismiss him outright. It's a proposal for a merger, Richard said, his voice measured. If everything goes well, it could mean significant growth for my company. Daryl nodded thoughtfully. Sounds like a big deal. Mergers can be tricky, though. Balancing the interests of all parties isn't easy. Richard raised an eyebrow, surprised by the insight. You've dealt with mergers before? A few times, Daryl said. In the nonprofit world, it's not mergers, per se, but collaborations. Different organizations coming together to pool resources and maximize impact. The stakes are different, but the challenges are similar: ego, trust, and finding common ground. Richard found himself intrigued, despite his initial reservations. And how do you handle that? Listening, Daryl said simply. Really listening. Most conflicts arise because people feel unheard. Once you address that, solutions tend to follow. The simplicity of the answer struck Richard. He had spent years perfecting the art of persuasion and negotiation, yet listening, a skill so basic it was often overlooked, had never been his strong suit. The conversation paused as the flight attendants collected empty glasses and distributed meals. Richard accepted his tray with a distracted nod, his mind still turning over Daryl's words. As they ate, Daryl spoke again. You've been with your company a long time, haven't you? 15 years, Richard replied. Started as a junior analyst and worked my way up. That's impressive, Daryl said sincerely. Not everyone has the perseverance to stick it out that long. It wasn't easy, Richard admitted, surprising himself. He rarely discussed the struggles behind his success. Long hours, cutthroat competition, constant pressure to perform. Daryl leaned back in his seat, his expression contemplative. Sounds like you've sacrificed a lot to get where you are. Richard nodded, though the acknowledgement felt heavier than he expected. It's the price you pay for success. Maybe, Daryl said, his tone thoughtful. But success is subjective, isn't it? What we value defines what we consider successful. Richard frowned slightly. And what do you value? Daryl didn't answer immediately. He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze distant. Connection, he said finally. Making a difference in people's lives. Knowing that what I do leaves the world a little better than I found it. Richard stared at him, unsure how to respond. The idea felt foreign, almost naive, yet there was a conviction in Daryl's voice that made it hard to dismiss. Don't get me wrong, Daryl continued, noticing Richard's hesitation. There's nothing wrong with ambition. But I've seen too many people climb the ladder only to realize it was leaning against the wrong wall. The metaphor hit Richard harder than he cared to admit. He thought of the countless hours he had spent chasing promotions, the relationships that had withered under the weight of his career, the moments he had missed with his family. Do you ever wonder, Richard began, then trailed off, unsure if he should continue. Wonder what? Daryl prompted gently. If it's all worth it, Richard finished, his voice barely above a whisper. Daryl studied him for a moment before responding. Sometimes, the question isn't whether it's worth it but whether it aligns with who you want to be. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He had always prided himself on his ability to project confidence and control, but in this moment, seated next to a man he had initially dismissed, he felt unmoored. Can I ask you something? Richard said after a pause. Of course, Daryl replied. What drives you? What keeps you going? Daryl smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. My mother, he said softly. She worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over our heads and still found time to volunteer at the local shelter. She taught me that success isn't about what you achieve for yourself, but what you contribute to others. The sincerity in his voice was disarming. For the first time in years, Richard felt the walls he had carefully constructed begin to crack. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing passengers for landing. The conversation ebbed, but the silence between Richard and Daryl was no longer uncomfortable. Instead, it felt like a pause in a symphony, a moment of reflection before the next note. As the plane began its descent, Richard looked out the window, the lights of Chicago glittering below. He had come on this flight expecting a routine journey, but the man seated beside him had made it anything but. Daryl had not only challenged Richard's assumptions, but also offered him a mirror, reflecting the choices he had made and the path he had taken. And for the first time in a long time, Richard wasn't sure if he liked what he saw. A new perspective takes flight. The descent into Chicago was smooth, the skyline a dazzling mosaic of lights against the evening sky. Inside the cabin, the energy was subdued yet anticipatory, as if everyone were quietly readying themselves for what awaited on the ground. Richard felt an unusual mixture of anticipation and unease. Something about the conversation with Daryl had stirred a part of him he rarely acknowledged, a yearning for something more meaningful than financial success or professional accolades. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to O'Hare International Airport. Daryl closed his book and placed it neatly on his tray table. He glanced at Richard, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. You okay? Daryl asked, his tone warm and genuine. Richard nodded reflexively but then paused. I don't know, he admitted, surprising even himself. I guess I'm just thinking. Daryl chuckled softly. Nothing wrong with that. The right questions usually lead to the right answers. Richard turned to him, studying the man he had been so quick to judge just hours earlier. Daryl's calm confidence, his willingness to engage without judgment, felt disarming. "I underestimated you," Richard said after a moment. Daryl raised an eyebrow, his expression inviting honesty. "When you first sat down," Richard continued, "I made assumptions about you. About who you were and why you were here. And I was wrong." Daryl nodded thoughtfully. "We all have biases, Richard. What matters is what we do when we recognize them." The words hit Richard like a jolt. He had spent his entire career priding himself on his analytical skills, his ability to assess situations and people with precision. But Daryl had shown him the blind spots in his perspective, and that realization was both humbling and liberating. The plane touched down with a slight bump, and the passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Richard felt a sudden pang of urgency. He didn't want to leave the conversation unfinished. As they waited for the plane to taxi to the gate, he turned to Daryl once more. "You mentioned earlier that success is about alignment with who you want to be. How do you figure that out?" Daryl smiled, leaning back in his seat as if settling into a deeper truth. "It starts with honesty, being brutally honest with yourself about what truly matters to you. Not what society says should matter, not what your boss or even your family expects, but what you value deep down. Then, it's about making choices that reflect those values, even when it's hard." Richard nodded slowly, the words resonating in a way he hadn't expected. He thought about his family, his wife and daughter, who he barely saw because of his relentless travel schedule. He thought about the younger version of himself, full of dreams, not yet tempered by the grind of corporate life. And he thought about the man he had become, successful, but strangely unfulfilled. The plane came to a stop, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began to stand, reaching for their carry-ons. Richard hesitated, watching as Daryl retrieved his worn backpack and slung it over one shoulder. "Daryl," Richard said, his voice carrying a note of urgency. Daryl turned, his expression open. "Thank you," Richard said. "For the conversation. For challenging me." Daryl smiled, extending a hand. "Thank you for being willing to listen." They shook hands, and in that brief moment, Richard felt a sense of connection that transcended the superficial divides he had once clung to. As they made their way down the jet bridge, Richard felt a strange lightness. The tension he had carried for the entire flight seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a quiet resolve. In the terminal, they went their separate ways, Daryl heading toward the baggage claim, Richard toward the exit. But as Richard stepped outside into the crisp Chicago air, he felt a newfound clarity. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in weeks. "Hey, honey," he said when his wife picked up. "I just landed. How's Sophie?" There was a pause on the other end, then a note of surprise in her voice. "She's good. She just finished her science project. She's been asking about you." Richard felt a pang of guilt, but also a surge of determination. "Tell her I'm coming home early. I'll be on the first flight back after my meeting tomorrow." His wife's voice softened. "She'll be thrilled. We both will." Richard hung up, a small smile tugging at his lips. For the first time in years, he felt like he was taking a step toward the person he wanted to be. In the days that followed, Richard found himself replaying the conversation with Daryl. The man's insights, delivered with such calm authority, had shaken Richard to his core. He began to make small but significant changes, delegating more at work to free up time for his family, reaching out to old friends he had lost touch with, and even volunteering at a local mentorship program. Months later, while scrolling through social media, Richard came across a video that made him pause. It was a clip of Daryl speaking at a community event, his voice steady and inspiring as he talked about breaking down barriers and building bridges. The caption read, "Daryl Jackson, Bridging Divides and Changing Lives." Richard watched the video in its entirety, a deep sense of gratitude swelling within him. He realized that the flight had been more than a chance encounter, it had been a turning point, a catalyst for change. And as he closed his laptop that evening, Richard made a silent vow to keep asking the hard questions, to keep challenging his assumptions, and to keep striving for a life aligned with his true values. The story of that flight remained with Richard, a reminder of how a single conversation could change the trajectory of a life. And though the world continued to spin with its complexities and divisions, Richard carried a newfound hope, a belief in the power of connection to transform even the most entrenched hearts.